Is game theory more popular when it's positive or negative? Being positive is the best. Well, a lot of advice on YouTube says being negative performs better. Oh. In a previous video, I downloaded all the transcripts from the YouTube channel Game Theory in order to analyze their words. I was especially interested in seeing if the original host, Matt, had the same writing style as his successor, Tom. So many of you pointed out an oversight in that video. Yes. I didn't know how to determine who the writer was for each video. You all pointed out that I could just look at the description of each video to see who wrote it. Who even reads the description? I even got a comment from Game Theory informing me of this. We should ask Matt if he wants to be interviewed about this. What? No, Matt left the channel years ago. Oh. Tom, Matt's successor, was the author of this comment. He also wrote that it would be interesting to see if incorporating these writing credits into the analysis would yield meaningful results. We should interview Tom about this. I don't think Tom wants to be interviewed about speech analysis. Oh. Tom also said something that was echoed by many of your comments, which was that it would be nice to expand this analysis beyond just game theory to the other theorists' channels as well. Okay, what if we just ask Tom if he wants to be interviewed? What would the interview be about? Like, maybe you could show him some new analysis and get his reaction? I think people would want to see that. Maybe, but I don't think Tom's gonna want to do that. I could send him an email and see. Okay, fine, buddy. I'll get my phone. Sometimes it's good to just give him a project. Now that I have the writing credits for all of the theorist channels, I want to see if I can perform an analysis on the individual writers of the scripts, not just the speakers of the videos. I'm gonna send the emails to him as you. I'm gonna pretend to be you. That's how this relationship has always worked. The biggest issue with using these writing credits is that for many of these episodes, there are multiple writers credited. So I'll have to see if I can effectively separate out the writers in order to produce a meaningful analysis. Otherwise, this is just a big waste of time. Tom, thank you for joining us here on the channel.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
He responded? He responded. Tom really is interested in this analysis. Apparently, he is.
Interesting. This is fantastic. Honestly, I mean, this is very in-depth. This is a lot of data.
In this video, we'll be analyzing the styles of the different writers for all 4 theorist channels. We'll be revealing individual writing patterns, comparing writers to one another, and performing sentiment analysis on them. And finally, we'll try to answer the question, do videos with more negativity get more views? And Tom will be providing his responses to all of this.
That tracks so hard immediately. So everything I just said is completely the opposite. We love data. It's what we do.
But enough talk, more data. It's data time!
I'm data.
In my last video, we analyzed all the transcripts from the YouTube channel Game Theory, but not the other channels. What are the other channels? They also have Film Theory, Food Theory, and Style Theory. Originally, Matthew Patrick hosted all of these channels. However, as he grew from 1 channel to 4, he needed to expand his team.
I was actually working as a producer for Disney, and then during COVID, we all were let go. And during that time, I basically emailed Matt saying, hey, here's my resume. I want to work for you. I've been a fan of yours since 2011. I eventually heard back from them. I auditioned for them then as a writer. They sort of looked at me and went, oh, he took this seriously. Okay, we should, and he's got producer experience. Actually, that's really useful because we're going to start having these roles called creative directors. I get hired as a creative director for Game Theory in October of 2021. And then, yeah, a few years went by and lo and behold, we're now here where I'm the host.
When Matt retired in 2024, he handed over hosting responsibilities to each creative director. Tom Robinson took over Game Theory, Forrest Lee took over Film Theory, Santi Massa took over Food Theory, and Amy Roberts took over Style Theory. Additionally, they employ a team of writers. So for our first report, I want to determine the scope of our analysis. I discovered over 50 writers that were credited across all 4 channels. However, many of these writers only wrote a few scripts. So I'm limiting the scope of this analysis to writers who have written at least 60 scripts. However, even with this limitation, some writers have written a lot of scripts, while others have written far fewer. But what's really challenging about these writing credits is that each episode is typically co-authored by multiple writers. And that is a challenge for our analysis. What's the issue? The biggest issue with doing this type of analysis is the co-authorship.
Yes.
Because a lot of your scripts are written by more than one person. And so if you try and compare writers, but two writers always write together, I have no way of distinguishing one from the other.
Yeah. So typically we have a writer and then we have the creative director will come in. And again, back in the day, it was me as the writer and creative director, and then Matt would also polish. That is very typical. Where you start to see lots of people, sometimes happens with our freelance team. The writers will write something that will go to one of our full-time lead writers. Then it comes to us. So that's sometimes why you get 3. But yeah, no, it makes complete sense from a data sense.
Wait, so you can't analyze each writer individually? Well, thankfully, most of the writers tend to write with different writing partners for each video. So I think I have enough different combinations of writers to create a meaningful analysis for each one. So the next thing I want to analyze is co-authorship combinations. I took all instances where 2 writers wrote together and plotted these values on a heat map matrix to highlight which writers tended to co-write the most with each other. So just looking at co-authorship here. So for example, for Matt, you and he wrote like 180 episodes together, which is by far larger than anyone else. After that, Matt wrote a lot with Justin.
Yes.
I think that was more back in the day. Also a lot with Forrest. With you wrote a lot with Matt, but also a lot with Mike.
Yes.
And with Eddie.
Yes.
And so those are some of the ones that sort of pop out.
That makes sense.
The other one that's interesting is that for Amy is one of the few people who didn't write the most with Matt. She wrote the most with Mike.
Yes.
And same for Mike. Mike wrote the most with Amy. They didn't write as much with Matt, whereas most of the other writers wrote a lot with Matt and then less with other writers. But this is just sort of an interesting way to show like, hey, we're gonna try and compare writers, but there's gonna be some similarities between writers who tend to write together.
Of course.
In order to analyze each writer, we first need to download all of the transcripts for all 4 channels. Since the theorists upload their own transcripts, we actually get pretty high quality data for most of their episodes. Why not all? Well, they didn't used to upload transcripts back in the day. Doesn't YouTube auto-transcribe those episodes? Yes. And it is pretty terrible. The auto-transcribing process is getting better, but for these older episodes, there is no punctuation. It's just a string of words with no periods. This becomes an issue for our next report, sentence length. For this report, we just have to exclude older transcripts that don't have any punctuation. If we look at which writers use the longest sentences, we see Zach has the highest number of words per sentence, followed by Matt and Tom. Conversely, Amy and Santi use the shortest sentences.
Some of that makes sense. Me and Matt had very similar writing styles in a lot of senses. We tended to prefer longer sentences with commas and give some drama or break up the sentence, whereas people like Amy tend to speak in much shorter statements. And part of that is because on game theory, it's much more law-based and so much more story-focused. And so it's like, let's tell these stretched out, elongated like ideas of flow of information. Whereas for style theory, it's a lot of facts and truths. It's a lot easier to go da, 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 da. And you can see Santi is also very similar. From a Santi perspective, he tends to be much shorter, much more brief, much more to the point. His episodes tend to be shorter generally, whereas game theory and film theory tend to have longer episodes. And so you fill out that time because you've got these longer sentences.
The next thing I want to analyze is vocabulary richness. Richness? Do the writers use a diverse lexicon, or do they repeat the same words over and over again? For this analysis, I'm using the Yule's K formula, which is a bit counterintuitive, as Tom learned.
That tracks so hard immediately. Seeing Lee right at the top, that makes sense.
Just to be clear, so this is vocabulary richness. Higher is more repetitive for this one here.
Interesting.
And this is more diverse. So the simplest way to calculate vocabulary richness is by using type token ratio. All that means is that you take the number of unique words in a writer's vocabulary and divide it by the total number of words written. So a person who just repeats the same word over and over again would have a score close to 0. And a person who never uses the same word twice would have a score of 1. However, the problem is that in practice, writers who write a large amount of words end up with a really low score. If you write double the number of words, you don't write double the number of new words. You typically just reuse most of the same words. In my experience, whoever writes the most has the lowest score, and whoever writes the least has the highest score. So instead, I prefer to use Yule's K, which is a more sophisticated formula. The important part of this function is that it's non-linear, so it scales better with larger texts. What's more confusing is that Yule's K is the opposite of TTR, since it's measuring repetition. So in this case, a higher score means the speaker has more repetition, whereas a low score means the speaker has a more rich, diverse vocabulary. This one is the one I prefer, the Yule's K. It tries to normalize it, so even if Matt has a lot of scripts and someone else has a small number of scripts, we're trying to really get as equal of a report as possible. The higher is more repetitive. So it's saying Forrest is saying a lot of the same thing, lower is more diverse. But it's interesting to hear your take. Your assumption was that Forrest has a very rich vocabulary.
Yeah, one of the notes he used to get very early on is, hey, you need to dumb this down, because he has such a good vocabulary that he would use words that most normal people wouldn't use in daily life. We try and aim for an 8th grade level. What it means is he has actually been using that and taking that into account, which is great. It's good. It's just a funny thing when, I was like, oh, I could imagine Lee having a much more wide vocabulary, but actually he has narrowed it down for his scripts.
Speaking of grade level, let's take a look at the reading level for each writer. For this analysis, I'm using the Fletch-Kincaid grade level formula. What? It's actually a surprisingly simple formula. So this is just taking word length and sentence length and incorporating that into the formula. So someone who uses a lot of big words and a lot of long sentences, they get a high score. From this formula, we see that Forrest writes at an 8th grade level. Amy and Santi are at the bottom with a 6th grade level. Matt and Tom are near the top again with a 13th grade reading level.
It makes some sense. It makes sense in the fact that Matt and I are very similar. Matt and I have a lot of run-on sentences. People like Amy and Santi don't, and so naturally their reading grade goes down. But the ones who are close together and similar make a lot of sense.
Next, let's look at how many questions they ask. Didn't you talk about that in the last game theory video? Yes, the AI analysis noticed that Matt asks more questions of the viewer than Tom does. So I wanted to find a more formulaic approach to investigate this. The simplest way is to just count the number of question marks per 1,000 words. Amy and Santi are at the top of this list and ask about twice as many questions as Tom and Zach do. Isn't that just random? Not according to Tom.
I have a real beef with rhetorical questions. I just had a meeting today with our writers where we talked about questioning. It is a very easy crutch for people to fall on when writing a script. You go, oh, but what about this? Or you might be wondering this. And that allows you to segue into your next point. But unless it's a question the audience is actually asking, we've seen this discussion online, we know that or it's just a very obvious question, it kind of falls into this crutch and the audience is sitting there going, I'm not asking that. Or why would we ask that there? So that's why I can see myself being quite so low, because I tend to avoid asking questions where I can. If I am asking questions, so I get a lot of questions early on, and then throughout the script, I tend to limit them if I can, whereas food and style tend to be much more question-based.
However, not all questions are necessarily rhetorical. So I had the system look for specific phrases that tend to infer rhetorical questions.
But that feels a little weird, right?
But what does it really mean?
How did you choose these phrases? These are not my choices. These are what I was told to look for, so I don't take any responsibility for the fact that Tom is actually at the top of this list.
So everything I just said is completely
the opposite. Yeah, it could be that it's not looking at all the keywords that we're considering.
Interesting to be that high up. I wonder, because again, looking at the other scripts in that sort of top range, because these 3 writers are part of our freelance team that were there when I joined, and so I wonder whether that's part of it, of from those early days before I made that decision, before I made that request, and I was polishing their scripts and I just kept their rhetorical questions in said scripts. That's interesting.
And now that you've given me that information, I might want to delve into that a little bit deeper and say, what exact phrases was it triggering on to see? It might be picking up on some phrases that you'd say, well, that's not a real rhetorical question.
For sure.
Did you look into this? Yes. I went down a rabbit hole trying to understand exactly what might be causing these counterintuitive results. It looks like I had a bug with my regex and I was dropping instances of right because of the question mark. When I fixed it and added it back in, Tom's rhetorical rate increased, but not as much as everyone else's. Now, instead of being at the top of the list, Tom is actually in the middle near Matt. So the other writers write more than Tom? Right. To see this more clearly, here is a breakdown of which phrases are used the most by all of the writers. Right is used the most, but what is used second most. However, if we look at just Tom's words, we see these are switched. But what is Tom's most common rhetorical phrase? And right comes in second. So, as you can see, just deciding what we consider to be in the list of rhetorical phrases can have a large impact on the results. What do you think of this list of rhetorical phrases? Do you like this type of analytical content? You're still watching this video. If you like this video, please like this video and subscribe. You can also hype this video, I think, but if you really want to support this channel, join my Patreon account in order to get your name in the credits. Finally, if you want to find out more about what I'm working on next, subscribe to my newsletter. No. The next metric that Tom had some interesting insight on was callback rate. What's that? That's where we look for certain key phrases that reference previously mentioned ideas. If we rank the writers by who uses these devices the most, we see at the top of this list is Luke, Justin, and Tom.
That's really interesting. So the reason that phrase started popping up for me in scripts was because of another bad writing habit I used to have that I then tried to drill out of all the other writers as well, which is put a pin in that. Asking someone to put a pin in something can be really detrimental to an audience's attention span, because either they'll forget because they're too busy watching the end of the video, so there was no point in asking them to like remember this thing, or they're so focused on this thing they don't listen to anything until the pin is brought back up. But actually, we found that it's better to just satiate them by getting to the point. I was like, oh, put a pin in it because we'll come back to this. Rather than just going, here's this idea, let's explain it in this context. Then when we get to the next set of context, we go, hey, remember earlier when I said this? Oh yeah, I do remember when you said that. And it's a very subtle difference that changes how scripting works and how an audience receives the information, which would explain why it's much higher for me, especially in law videos where you've got lots of moving pieces. I tend to be jumping back and forth between information, but because it was also a habit that I purposely avoided was asking people to hold on to information until I got to it.
The next metric we're going to look at is first-person pronouns. How often do writers refer to themselves using words like I, me, and mine? Amy is at the top, whereas Tom only uses them about half as often. However, that's just singular usage. If we instead look at plural usage, like we, us, and ours, we see that Amy is still at the top, but Tom has also jumped up to second place. I wanted to know if this could have any significance.
A lot of it comes down to personal preference of the host, but it also comes down to some of the channel history. Matt is a part of this channel. It is a part of the history. He always will be. We're in a new phase and he's no longer with the company. And so there was just an effort to try and maybe be a little bit less overt. Matt did this, Matt did this, Matt did this, because what it can do is undermine me and the work that I have done behind the scenes, or the work that I am continuing to do with this channel and this franchise. And so talking in the we have worked on this. We as a group have worked on this. I helped Matt do a thing. There's also then the element of trying to include the audience. It's like, we have done this. It's not just we, the company, but it's we, the community, we, the theorists. People are becoming more aware that we have a team of researchers and a team of writers. Using a lot of I statements can sometimes rub people the wrong way because they're like, well, we can see there's another writer on this. Style and food are different. Well, one style was very young when Amy took over. It was only like a year old when Amy took over, and she'd been working on it since the beginning anyway, so it was a lot of I. But both food and style do a lot more experiments, a lot more in-person stuff, a lot more experiential stuff where it's like, I'm going to try this. And so it's a lot more personal, whereas film and game are much more objective, where we're looking at a thing and going, this is what is happening over here. And so that would cause that separation, which I think is interesting.
I think that's interesting. I think that's how I considered it as well when I first started looking into it, but there's another consideration that I think might also be important to look at, which is just how you frame things.
Yes.
For example, if I'm an aggressive person, I might say, you are not making sense. But if I'm a more passive person, I'll say, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. And so you're contextualizing it from your understanding, your frame of reference, and it might make it sound a bit softer, a bit more agreeable.
That makes a lot of sense, especially, I versus you is a big one. That's interesting. Really interesting.
Next, I want to compare the writers to each other using stylometric analysis. What? That's where we analyze different features of the writers in order to see which writers are most similar. What features are you looking at? A lot of the features we already talked about, like question rate and pronoun rate. but also the use of function words like the, and, of. Those aren't meaningful words. Exactly. We tend to use those words at consistent rates without even realizing it. So they are less prone to manipulation, even when the writer is trying to speak in a different voice. The results of this analysis provide a similarity score between every combination of writers. I took these scores and plotted them on another heat map matrix to highlight which writers are most similar to one another. For you, there's a lot of similarities with Eddie, your brother, right?
Yes.
And you haven't written that many scripts with him compared to Matt. You and Matt are not as similar, even though you and Matt have written a lot more scripts together.
Yeah.
I don't know if that sounds significant. I'm not surprised that two people who grew up together tend to share similar speaking styles.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We also looked at many of the other similarities the heat map revealed, and Tom had some interesting insights on those.
Some of that as well will come down to what channel they are writing for. We try really hard to train our writers to understand the different voices of each channel. Mike wrote a game theory script and versus his food theory scripts, and those will look different because he's trying to work within mine and Santi's different writing styles. So there's some element of that. Eddie and I and his scripts don't often take much polishing because he writes in a similar way to how I write and how I think, which, yeah, being related, that's going to happen. But like looking at Amy and Mike, that makes a lot of sense because Mike is our lead writer for style and for food theory specifically. He has written for the other channels as well, but those are kind of his key focuses. So them having similarities there makes a lot of sense. And then similar Mike and Santi, he has a focus on that channel. And so therefore the writing style is similar, whereas people like Eddie have ended up being much more of a game focus, especially when it comes to indie horror.
So for Matt, the most similar one is Zach and also Stephanie, which again, I'm going to assume that the relationship between those two affects the similarity in their speech patterns.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, let's look at the sentiment analysis of the writers. Sentiment analysis? That's where we have the computer try to analyze the context of the words written by each writer to see how positive and negative they are. Amy is the most positive, while at the bottom, Zach, along with Tom and his brother, are the least positive. Does Tom think he's the least positive? He was not surprised by it.
We talk about a lot of bad things happening. We talk about a lot of negative things and go, that's not great. You know, we're talking about FNAF and Poppy Playtime and all these indie horror games where awful things happen to children. I did a whole video recently about how the indie horror space has kind of just dried up and it ended up being a lot of rinse and repeat, a lot of just bad quality games. And like, so we make fun of those games and we tend to be like, this is dumb, this is silly. When we're talking about like other creators, we try really hard to not like punch down because it's like, hey, we're all in this together. It's not a good look for a channel of our size to suddenly just be like talking badly about all these other people. We're dissing on the bigger franchises. Like we've done whole videos about why Star Wars is falling apart. And so I'm sure that also plays a part in it versus Amy and Santi. A lot of food theory and style theory videos are trying to help the viewer. And so I would imagine that that's playing a big part in why the data has turned out that way.
For completeness, I also measured everyone's negativity, and it's basically the inverse of their positivity. Writers with high positivity had low negativity, though that doesn't have to be the case. Tom and Eddie are at the top, and Amy and Luke are at the bottom. But what's important to note is that everyone is more positive than negative.
Yeah, we always want to strive for positivity more so. Again, like we don't want to punch down to people. And also, if you're just constantly being negative, it gets draining, it gets tiring. Rage bait channels and like drama channels exist and they all sort of fizzle out eventually because just negativity just eventually gets like tiring. We always want to like have some kind of positive message. Yeah, be uplifting and enjoyable and entertaining as opposed to being entirely just like, oh, it's all doom and gloom, everything's crap.
Finally, I want to compare episode sentiment to views. To see what gets you more views? Exactly. Does being more negative get you more views? Let's look at the sentiment per video and correlate it to the view count. Is there a relationship between the two?
Absolutely.
And so I've done a scatter plot of all of the episodes. This is a lot to take in.
Dang.
The x-axis here is sentiment. So the left-hand side is very negative, the right-hand side is very positive. And then view count, this is done logarithmically, low view count at the bottom, high view count at the top. And these lines are the trend for each of the channels. A horizontal line means there's no trend.
Yep.
And these lines are almost horizontal, meaning you could be positive and get views or not. You could be negative and get views or not. There's not a huge correlation to say, when you did negative videos, you got a lot more views. No, I would say whoever says, hey, be more negative, you get more views, not for the theorists.
Yeah, no, what we found is for things like title and thumbnail can sometimes help. This thing is great or this thing is bad is a good way to get people in the door. But once people are in, as long as you kind of like set up what it is and sold it well, people tend to stick around.
I would also speculate your channel is rather positive in general. And I think if you start being more negative, you would probably lose some of your audience that says, well, that's not what I'm here for.
A lot of YouTube comes down to how you set yourself up to begin with. When you're starting out, you're kind of like setting yourself up in a way. So it's like, are you going to be positive? Are you going to be negative? You will probably get stuck in that way for a good while. And it will take a long time to move out of that realm, which is why we prefer to skew positive if we can. Because one, the internet can be a bit of a treacherous place sometimes. And so we want to spread positivity. If everyone's positive and everyone has that starting point of positivity, it's much easier to be nice and it's a better long-term trajectory. Whereas I think a lot of the negative channels can kind of have these big blow-up bursts when drama happens, when something happens, like, oh yeah, we can really hammer on this. But over time, people get bored. So it's always better to start at the positive end if you can, especially as it makes no difference.
Now that Tom has seen all of my analysis, I wonder what he thinks of it. Was there anything that we talked about that was of particular interest that you say, yeah, that makes sense, or, oh, that is counter to what my intuition is?
Yeah, it's fascinating to kind of to see it all laid out is really, really interesting. A lot of it makes sense. A lot of it tracks with kind of what I would think. There's nothing that super surprised me other than, like I say, the rhetorical question stuff.
Now that you've seen this, would there be anything additional you'd say, oh, I'm really interested to see more details in this thing versus that thing?
Honestly, I mean, this is very in-depth. This is a lot of data. It'd be interesting to see like the evolution over time, like per year. So Eddie started writing in 2021, I think it was. Does his writing style get more similar as time goes on? Or did it start off similar? Like where's that shift? I think would be an interesting one. But yeah, this is fantastic.
If you're interested in seeing this report for yourself, I've added a link to it in the description.
We are so thankful for our writing team. Without them, we couldn't run 4 channels every single week. It requires people. It requires a team to make what we do happen. And it's a wonderful team of people, and we're so thankful for them. And so it's so nice. It's so fun to see data like this and just see it all put together and see how it all grows and how it all evolves over time.
Thanks to Tom for going over my analysis with me. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun getting to talk about this stuff, and we love data. It's what we do. So I'm so excited that we got to share all of this. It's so fun.